My name is Martha Saavedra. I am the Associate Director of the Center for African Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. And in addition to doing that, I have a long-standing interest in sport in Africa, particularly women's sport and sport and development.
Could you briefly tell us what your presentation was about?
It was a reflection on the work itself. The title was The Knowledge and Meaning in African Sport. So on one hand, I wanted to look at the production of knowledge and the work that has been done by academics mainly. So I used a cheap trick of going to Google Scholar and looking at publications that would come up if you plugged in African sport over a series of years. And you could definitely see that in the 1970s and 80s, there maybe were, the numbers that would pop up in any one year were 100, 200 publications. And of course, not all of those were actually about African sport. There's the odd algorithms that Google Scholar uses to pick things. But over time, particularly as you got into 2000 and then beyond, and when this conference started in 2004, over the last 10 years, there's been an explosion of literature and publications that have something to do with African sport. And so the numbers would go, 200, 300, and then, right now in 2012, there was over 4,000 publications. And so we can expect to see that rise. And I suppose if somebody had done the search on, Kenyan sport or South African sport or the Nigerian sport and different types of sports, cricket, we were just talking about Zimbabwean cricket, you would find that, I think it would be interesting actually to look, but I'm pretty sure that you would find this sort of low level of publications and then an explosion, which basically is just an indication of the production of knowledge, the fact that people are doing research. So that was one of the things that I was looking at. Just wanting to explore a bit about the meaning of sport and to look at some of the publications, the kinds of things that were being published. We just had a discussion about South Africa in the last session here. And of course, for much of the period that I looked at, the publications largely were dealing with South African sport and apartheid and the boycott. And then post-apartheid and the recovery, and so South Africa dominates to much extent, that at least that Google search. But there are, other, starting in the 1980s, the late 1980s, and even when you get into the 90s a little bit more, beginning to be really serious work on the sociology, the history of African sport, and looking in different places in Tanzania, in Nigeria, in various parts. And then the new cycle of sport and development, especially 2005, has really added to the literature. And so part of it was to make that point that it's become this very dynamic field. And then there were a few maybe methods, I should say, that people should really think about more. And one point is that all the work is good, but we need to maintain academic rigor and scholarly rigor, and by that to ground our work, particularly in an understanding of the context, the history. We've had a couple of discussions today about the importance of really situating the work in history and not forgetting the larger communities in which the sports that we're looking at are taking place in, and what I call sort of the null hypothesis or the counterfactual. So how do we really claim that what we're looking at is something unique and interesting? How can we show that there's some intervention or there's some activity that is so different? And we have to be really rigorous, I think, about that in our work. So that was one of the things that I was pointing out. And then finally, the last point was something that I worked on is sexuality, gender and sexuality in sport. And at this time on the African continent, there's a lot of focus on homosexuality and laws against homosexuality. And so to some extent, yes, one might want to look, in the United States, we've had a couple of male athletes come out recently as gay. And while that, in terms of sport, is important to look at the issues of homosexuality in sport, and I think it's very much integrated in it, I guess my point about that was, particularly for women in sport, but also for men, because of the physicality of the sport and the way that it reflects expectations about gender performance and culture, we do need to explore this because it can be very limiting. And so for women particularly, notions of sexuality will define how they can participate in sport if they feel bound by their communities and the cultural expectations. And so women soccer players or football players in much of the world, certainly in many African countries, whether they are or not, are considered lesbians by just automatically. Not as scholars, we're not necessarily activists to change that per se, but I think it's an important area to interrogate and try to pull apart the connections between people's expectations of the sexuality and performance of sexuality and what that means for the sports that anyone might participate in.
So going forward, what would you like to see then in such research?
Going forward, definitely more rigor. And I think today at the conference there was always conferences, they bring people together and talk. But I think one of the events today was about a reading group, and we were participated by Skype with a group of people who've been meeting for a couple of years to read literature and then move forward. And I think that having a community of scholars who are willing to ask hard questions and push each other, whether it's on theory, on method, on the way that you gather data, or helping each other find data or think about the work. I think that working together as a community probably is very key. Willing to ask hard questions, as well to push into other disciplines. And sport in the academy is often seen as something of the lesser quality, so that sport, it's very hard to get a lot of other academics interested in appreciating the value of understanding sport and how sport can open up an understanding of other dynamics within a community. So reaching out to other disciplines and making sure whether people go to conferences or publish in different journals or in their faculties or among their classmates to push these issues forward and have these conversations. And as well within, especially for sport and development, within the development community of practitioners and the people who really aren't looking at sport at all, or it's sort of peripheral, to continue to have conversations with them. And not just because we want to evangelize and let people understand, but also to be challenged and actually really, how important is this? Is it really important? And to, we love sport, so we do it, and we find an excuse to do it professionally so we can study it. But the validity of it in sort of knowledge production and explorations of the world around us, scientific explorations. This is an area where I think we just don't want to sit back and say, okay, we've had several years, we're producing 4,000 journal articles a year. This is great. Let's really challenge ourselves more.
Yeah. So speaking of important, how important is having a forum such as this conference on sports in Africa and the Global South?
I think that it has been incredibly important. We have seen several iterations of students who started at the beginning as undergraduates are now getting their PhDs. So, and they've had a community, they've had a group of people to move along. I can't prove it, but I can say that at least some of those 4,000 articles were definitely generated out of the activity here, and the journal Impumelelo that has gone along with this. So Gerard Akindes alone has definitely done a lot to keep conversations, and in a very quiet way. He keeps the conversation going at multiple levels, and it's to have people like him, and also conferences like this, and journals like the Impumelelo and others that keep the conversation going. It's difficult. It's difficult in that universities are changing, the academy's changing. People talk about the corporatization or privatization, the corporate model coming into the university, and as always, if you're not an academic department, it's often hard to justify spending time on doing something, finding resources to doing something. So this very interdisciplinary work that's focused, it's not just on Africa, but Africa's at the center, which is key. I think it's more than a labor of love. I mean, there's a real there is a constituency that's behind it, and it's had some good support, but it is to have a place like this and an event like this really helps to energize people and provide them that camaraderie and support to keep on moving forward. So there's that sort of continual motion, that happens at one conference, the next conference, and people that have met each other and continuing to work. So it's important in that sense, yeah.
Okay. So if you have any final thoughts, or if you have any thoughts on expectations going forward about such a conference, or anything you'd like to add?
Well, I think one thing we've seen is the development of technology, and even when computers reset themselves in the middle of your Skype conversation or something, we still have our technological challenges. But on the other hand, we are very, I think, in a moment where some of the problems maybe at the universities or within the academy that we can use technology to bound ahead of and begin to find other ways of continuing, and not always a virtual sense. I mean, it's the e-conferences or something may not necessarily be the future, but I think that pulling together a community of people through the internet and other kind of technologies, that's something that I think is established, and certainly Gerard Guindes is going to be part of that, and other people are a part of keeping that going. And hopefully there will be more conferences like this, and in some format or the other in the future, where people come face to face and actually meet, eat, drink, do these human functions together that help to build that solidarity and continue meet new people and continue to move forward.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Martha. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, thank you.